All right. I think it's time to get started. My name is Rolando Scott, and we're going to be tackling configuration management head on today. I chose this topic, and it's a bit of an important topic because I feel a lot of people don't really know or have issues with configuration. It's one of those things that it's sometimes a second nature thing for developers. But as we've seen, it's not always developers that are working on sites, right? We have site builders, we have clients, we have a bunch of other people that touch sites and have no idea of what configuration is or what configuration management does. And then we start running into issues, right? But before we begin, let me talk a little bit about myself. Like I said, I'm Rolando Scott. I'm currently the director of Drupal development at Toyota. I oversee around 35, I think, right now. Amazing Drupal developers. I've been around Drupal since Drupal 6. And like I was saying, I am currently based off San Jose, Costa Rica. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you guys and presenting this topic. Like I said, this session is directed to developers, but also to project managers and basically anybody who interacts with the admin interface of Drupal, right? And while most of what I'm saying does apply to Drupal 9, I did this presentation thinking about Drupal 8, so there might be a couple of small things here and there that might change in Drupal 9, but for the most part, it's basically the same. So again, configuration management, right? Why, right? We see it all the time. We see it when clients or when a project manager does a change on the site, and then somebody does a deployment and it gets wiped out, or somebody synchronizes configuration and they didn't see there were other changes there, and it's one of those nice and fun Drupal things where you press a button and it's gone forever, unless you had it on the repo somehow. To be honest, when I see and hear people struggling with keeping several environments up to date or synchronized, I always imagine one of those cheesy infomercials. Like you guys know the ones, right? Like, do you need help keeping your configuration in check? Why do things keep breaking when I do deploys? Is there even any help for me? That's what I always think of when I see this. But the good news is there is a lot of help out there, and I'm here to show you how easy it is to basically keep your configuration in check. So let's start off by just saying, what is configuration management, right? Configuration management is a collection of admin settings that determine how the site functions as opposed to the content of the site. So configuration will typically include things such as the site name, the content types, fields, taxonomy, vocabularies, views, and so on, right? Configuration management allows you to synchronize configuration between different instances of the same Drupal site. So for example, if I have a dev environment and I have a live environment, right? I can test things on the dev environment, and I am with 100% confidence knowing that if it works on the dev environment, it'll work on the live environment, right? And it's also configuration is actually a set of files that can be saved and maintained by the repo or version control of your choice. Let's start off by the number one question is, what is a configuration change? What are changes that trigger a configuration change? So let's talk about the easy ones, right? Any content type, any fields, any change made on the configuration screen of the admin section, right? The admin config. Web forms, views, display modes, those are all easy ones that when you change, make a change, add, delete, do anything to those, then a new configuration file is changed, right? The easy ones that aren't, as any content that's added as a content type, any web form submission, any files or any sort of media, and menu links. The menu itself is part of configuration, but the menu links aren't, right? But now we start seeing where it gets iffy, right? So again, taxonomy and vocabularies are configuration, but the taxonomy terms are not. And this sometimes creates issues on sites that use taxonomy terms as structural building blocks instead of just ways to categorize content. Like, I don't know if most people understand that a taxonomy term is an entity like other Drupal entities, and it can have fields, it can have display modes. So you could basically build a page off your taxonomy term, right? But what happens when you built this page on Dev of this based on this taxonomy term, and then you have other functionality built into it, when you push the configuration to another environment, that term doesn't exist necessarily. So it might bring some issues, right? The other part where it gets iffy, and I think you guys just noticed that in the chat, is that when you push up a block, the block settings, the settings of a block are configuration, but the actual block content is not. So basically, when we push this configuration up to another environment, we're telling Drupal, hey, there's this block, here's the settings for it, and this is the reference, but that reference of the content doesn't exist. So we end up getting this nice error message saying that the content is missing, or you need to fix it. So yeah, it's definitely, these are the parts where it gets kind of iffy, right? I will say that back in the good old days, and I say that a little bit sarcastically, in Drupal 7, we used to use a module called features. I don't know if anybody's used it, but features is not the same as configuration management. You could basically select what you wanted. It didn't have to be the whole site. You could select certain fields, certain configuration, and you could export that in a way that it could be imported into another site. Now, one of the main differences is that it didn't have to be the same site. It could be a completely different site. For example, if you created a blog content type with a couple of fields, you could export that and then you could import it. Features is available for Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, I think. I want to say Drupal 8 for sure. But it's not the same as configuration management, right? All right, so let's talk about what's in a configuration file, right? In a configuration file, it's a YAML file, right? So it has a unique ID. It has languages, statuses, weights, dependencies. It basically is a file that Drupal reads and says, okay, so I have to create this content type. This content type has this field, it has this name, it has this label. Should I show the label? Should I show this? Should I create an automatic URL when it's saved? All these options are saved into this one file and is read by Drupal. When you are installing a new module, I don't know if you've actually gone into a module folder and see the files, a lot of these contrib modules actually include configuration files for the initial setup, right? So when you install the module, that file gets copied over and you have like a base starting point of the module. Afterwards, any change that you do to the configuration of that module, it's saved as part of your configuration, and it's owned by the site and not by the module. That's also important. So let's talk about workflows, right? There's two main ways of synchronizing and working with configuration management, right? The first option is using the UI. So we have an overview page at that address, right? Admin.config development configuration. It tells us a bunch of different things. It can tell us if our configuration is in sync with what's currently in the files, right? If I go into this site and I make a change, it will alert me that there's a difference, right, between what's currently on the site and what's on the files, right? And it allows me to also import all and basically grab everything, the configuration that's saved on the files, and apply it to the site. So it's an easy way to basically, if you've moved the files over, maybe using Git or some sort of other way, it's an easy way to synchronize the files, and it can tell you literally what the changes are and what it's going to affect. One of the fun things about this is that there is no back button of this. So if you've made a bunch of changes and you synchronize and you import the synchronization, if you import the new configuration, there's no going back to this unless you have some sort of backup or some of other way of recovering the changes you had made. Using the UI, you could also export the whole configuration. So if you, for example, have a dev environment and have a live environment, you can do all the changes in the dev environment, go to the export page, it'll give you one compressed file, and then you can go to the import page of the live environment, import it, and it'll sync correctly with all the changes that you did in dev, right? There's also the option of seeing one single file instead of the whole configuration. Then if you see the single file, it'll show you what the file looks like on the screen. Then you can copy and paste it and use whatever you want. The other workflow is using Drush, right? For those who might not know, Drush is a command line tool that does a bunch of things in Drupal, but among the many things it does, it helps with configuration. So there's a Drush command to export the configuration. There's a Drush command to import it. And when you run it, it'll tell you exactly what configuration file is being changed and what, what's being, if it's being created, if it's being updated, or if it's being deleted, right? Which it no longer exists. So, Drush is the easy way for developers to use. So at Teoti, we have this workflow, right? This is how we normally approach configuration, right? We, all of our devs develop locally, right, on their own computers, right? Once they're done doing the changes, they export the configuration via Drush, like we just saw. They'll commit and push this configuration up to the repo. We use CircleCI as our continuous integration tool that grabs that repo and imports, rebuilds the dev environment where we mostly host on Pantheon, and imports the configuration automatically. So that is the way we make sure that dev is always in sync and has the latest configuration applied to it, right? Because it's not like if you push the configuration files, that doesn't mean that they're synchronized yet, right? They're there, but they're not synchronized. Using a continuous integration tool like CircleCI, we can make sure that it's not something, oh, I forgot, right? It automatically does it for you, right? And one of the most important things is that we stash the configuration files one level underneath the web folder. It's just best practices to not have those files be accessible via a browser. And you can configure this in the settings file. All right, so some things to consider, right? One of the common issues that we see is when changes are made directly to a different environment without exporting the code, right? This happens a lot. Somebody goes in and makes a change on the live environment of a site, and those settings never get exported and put into the repo. So eventually, when somebody is synchronizing code, it'll wipe it out. It'll completely reverse all the changes that you have done. Or another issue that we see is the configuration is actually never synchronized. So the different instances are not consistent. Quick story: we had a humongous site. A client came to us with their very big site that is hosted on Acquia, and their previous developers, they told us that the issues they had with the previous developers is that sometimes, they would push a new feature and it would work on dev, and it would kind of work on test, and then it would kind of work differently on the live site, and so on and so on. And we took a look at the site, and it was because they had never ever synchronized configuration. So that meant that those developers were literally pushing code on dev, then recreating the same functionality manually on test environment, and then recreating the same functionality again on the live environment. I mean, that gets super messy really fast, right? Because you have to do exactly the same things over and over again. Which is obviously not the way, but it's something that we do see sometimes when configuration isn't used at all. So this is what you shouldn't do, right? You should avoid making configuration changes on a live Drupal site, right? That's what we shouldn't do. But also, we do have to acknowledge, right, that clients are clients, and they will make changes because at the end of the day, it is their site, right? And they maybe are not knowledgeable enough to know that they have to go through the repo, or that they do is, that there's different ways. They don't know. They're just trying to make their site look better or work better, right? And it is their site, so they should have access to that to it. So what we do is, when we're about to push something to production, we go into production first and look at that configuration screen, right? We look at that screen and see if the client has actually made any change first. We try to understand what those changes are. If there's a way to basically copy that change back manually, or do we need to export that configuration from the live site and synchronize it with ours? But basically take a look at what's on the live site before we push to production, right? Because we don't want two things to happen. Either we just push to production and synchronize our changes, and then we wipe out everything the client has done, or even worse, well, I think that's the worst part, but another issue that could occur is that you push to production without knowing, and when you go to the configuration synchronization page, you realize that there's other changes and they might not be compatible with what you're pushing up, and then now you're in a pickle because you can't really synchronize your changes without destroying something else, and it just gets really messy. So always make sure to look at the live site before you push anything to production, and you guys know where to look for it now. Another thing that you shouldn't do is making changes to the files directly. You can, it's not the end of the world, but YAML files have a specific, formatting and spacing and a bunch of other things, and it's really easy to mess up a configuration file if you edit it directly. So it's always better to just do the change that you want on your website and then export it, and you're good to go. I won't dive deep into this because could be a whole different session, but the main three hosting providers have different ways of managing the configuration files. I know Acquia has like 2 versions of it. Pantheon is a little bit more straightforward. It only has 1 version of it. But yeah, it's depending on where you are and what you're doing, and where you're hosting, I'm sorry. It's important to take note and read the documentation of each hosting provider to know how it works for them, right? One of the amazing things that Drupal has, right, and this applies to basically any subject, is the contrib modules, right? And configuration management is no different from that. So there are a couple modules, and of course this list is a lot bigger, but I'm just going to quickly talk about some of these that extend the functionality of configuration management. One of the ones I like the most, but it is kind of evil because of the reason we just talked about, is configuration read-only mode. What that does, if you install this module, it doesn't allow the client or anybody to do any change on your site that triggers a configuration change. So basically, what can be done on the site is just adding content, right? But again, at the end of the day, the client site is the client site, right? So using this module is, I think for developers, is a little bit like, yes, hopefully we could use it, but for the client, maybe they want to add another web form, maybe they want to add another taxonomy vocabulary. With this module installed, they wouldn't be able to. But at the same time, you would make sure they wouldn't be able to break their site, right? I know there's different opinions on it. Configuration split is another good one, where you, depending on the environment, you can have it run certain configurations on one environment different than the other ones. A normal use case of this is Google. Google Ads, and also anything that we don't want running on Dev, for example, because we don't want the impressions for Google Ads to come out on Dev, because it throws an erroneous number, but we actually do want that to work on the live site, right? So stuff like that. Recreate block content is a module that basically allows the content of the block to be part of the configuration. So when you push the configuration of a block, it carries the content, and you don't get that error message that we saw before, which is very important, right? So that is one thing. Configuration ignore is one of my favorites. We use it a lot on our sites. So for example, on our local environments or on dev, all the performance options are turned off. There's no caching. We're not aggregating CSS or JS. But on the live site, it's always turned on. So no matter if somebody by mistake pushes that configuration about turning off caching and stuff on the live site, it's never going to turn off when we synchronize because it's being ignored. The other one, configuration menu link, carries the menus along with the configuration of the menu. So you not only push the menu, but you also push the links up. And then structure sync is a massive module that allows you to carry a bunch of different content, like taxonomy terms, like menu items. So when you push the configuration of the taxonomy vocabulary, for example, it automatically pushes the terms as well. I've had mixed results with structure sync. It sometimes creates a little bit of more issues, but yeah, it's great for. It's also great for blocks. That is correct. Thank you, Ray. So some key takeaways from today, right? So configuration management is a great thing to have, right? It's a must use if your sites have more than one instance, which should almost be the case, right? But I know there's some Drupal sites that exist out there that are just that site, but for professional development, you should always have more than one instance of the site. And now we understand, how to import it, how to export it, and why changes get wiped out, and how to avoid it, right? You don't have to fear it. You just have to understand it, like mostly everything we do. And now that you know what changes that you do create a configuration change, now you can, if you're a project manager that's going in there and changing certain things, you can let your fellow developer know, hey, I changed this. Let's be on the lookout. If you're a developer, you know when you need to export configuration, and anybody else that touches the site, they kind of understand when a configuration file is created and when it's not. Great. So now is the time for questions. I think we have a few. Yes, I am going to make the slides available as soon as the session is over. Let's go through the questions. I think that. Let's see. Elaine asked, "What's your strategy for managing blocks?" Yep, there is modules that help for that. We try to not install a lot of modules, unnecessary modules. So what we do when we're building out a site is we create the block in the highest environment available. For example, if we have the test environment and dev environment and the locals, if you create the block in the test environment and then pull down that configuration to the dev environment and make sure that when developers are grabbing the site for their development to grab like the database and the current configuration, then that works. That means that whenever you push up, all the configuration for that block is already in sync and it won't be destroyed. That's one of the ways I prefer it. But again, there are modules that help serve this. Do you use, Enrique is asking, do you use configuration split? If so, do you recommend any particular strategy? As in, what splits do you usually create? Environmental splits, functionality? Yep. So yeah, I think basically we split things. We do a combination of splitting and ignoring, right? To me, splitting is things that are like functional, that are client related most of the times, that we don't want impressions on the dev site. We don't want, analytics. Google Analytics is a big one. We don't want Google Analytics to be shown on dev and on test environments, just so they don't get visits from devs from different parts of the country or the world. So that's when I use configuration split. And configuration ignore is for functional things, like I just mentioned. To me, configuration ignore is for example, on dev having the update module installed, but on on the live environment, not having it installed, or like I mentioned, the performance ones, stuff like that. That's what we use configuration ignore for. Ryan, what is the best way to handle removing modules from your production side environment? Like in terms of workflow, we have issues with database errors upon configuration sync when the module is removed. Yes, um, that's a great question. As the answer, I'm sorry, it's looking a little fuzzy here. There we go. You know, if you can remove a module from a production environment, right? And it should work. It should be able to remove the module. I think the most important thing to do is when you go back and are about to push code to the live environment, you also remove the module there, right? So when the configuration that's being pushed up to the production environment already includes removing that module, so you won't have any issues because of it. Because if you don't, what happens is that the configuration that you're pushing up includes that module, right? And it's going to try to reinstall it again, and that's where the issues become start happening, right? Because now maybe you deleted some other things that were related to that module, and now it needs it again, and so make sure that you can remove the module from your production side environment, but it's always best to go back and in dev or in your local, remove that module again and push that configuration up so it doesn't get reinstalled again when you're pushing up. Anthony asks, as a person coming from Drupal 7, what is the difference between configuration manager and features? As I see it, they both manage your site configurations and setting, or am I missing something? Sure. So I think you guys have kind of already talked about it in the chat, but when you use features can be used to not only do, like, you can select what features you want, right? There's definitely some features that that you might want. Like I gave the example of a specific, like if I'm making a blog and I have a couple of fields and I want to push that up. With configuration management, it's the whole site. It's basically everything in configuration. And also one thing that happens a lot when you use features is that you don't really have to use it. So it's easy to basically import a feature and then have another developer do some changes, and then you try to re-import that feature again, and then you run into issues. That's also a problem, right? So yeah, that's I think that's the biggest difference. Features were never made to keep these things into configuration. Let's see, whoa, we have a bunch of questions. I'll be sure to try to get through all of them right now. Is there a way to see, Kevin asks, is there a way to see which permissions are related to values managed as configuration? All the permissions that a user has are managed as configuration, basically all of them. So I'm not sure if I'm not understanding your question correctly, but yeah, any change you do to permissions is a configuration change. Nicholas asked, do you have a workflow for getting config changes from production back to the code base? Yeah, it's the easiest thing. Like once you know that you are gonna have some changes in production, all you have to do is you can use the UI, you can export the full file, and that file is a compressed file of all the configuration files. You can extract that, copy those files over to the repo, and just save that and push that commit, and you can call it, like, synchronizing configuration from the live site, and that's basically it. Again, the only thing where this gets kind of tricky is if the client is changing some part of the site that is also being worked on, right? So if I don't know, the client or on the production side, a field was removed and that field is used for something else that you're doing while building out the site, then yeah, sure, that gets tricky really quickly. But it's one of those things that you kind of have to manage and take a look and see one by one on a one-by-one cases what configuration you should save, either the live site or the one you're working on. How can you manage configuration for different sites in a multi-site setup? That question is very interesting. To be completely frank, I have not used multi-sites in a very long time. and I would not want to answer that question erroneously. So I will keep that in my back pocket and research it a little bit, because I'm not really sure how it works. I would kind of assume that since it's the multi-site, it's shared, yeah, or it's split somehow. But I apologize, I do not. I shy away from multi-sites a lot. Let's see. Mitchell says, when you make a config change on dev and push it to prod, do you need to write a update using hook? Just no, a hook update is not needed at all. You can just run the sync. That is when you make a change to dev. And for example, I'm going to take the Pantheon example, right? Just because that's what we use. And if you make a change on dev, and then well, I'm sorry, when you create the changes in the repo, right, and you push it to dev, when you push that to test, it's pushing the same files, right, from the master branch up to test, and then it's pushing the same files to the live environment, right? So all you have to do is synchronize. You do not have to do a hook update for sure. On remote multi-site platforms like Acquia Site Factory, all subsites share the same setting file. Do you know how the configuration splits the different sites can be implemented? Yep, I think I just answered that question before, that I just do not know enough between multi-sites, and especially on like a vendor like the Acquia Site Factory. You would have to check with their documentation, how they manage things. How would you handle situations where configurations are expected to be different between test and prod environment? Chris asked this. All right, so there are, like, and I've mentioned this a couple of times now, there are use cases where we are expecting the configuration to be different, right, in test and prod, analytics, Google AdWords, ads, I'm sorry. So using configuration split or configuration ignore is your way to go. So that way you do have two configurations that are different, but you can still deploy and synchronize without running into any issues. Caroline is asking, how do you manage config for a distribution where many sites will have the same starting code, but will change config and need to be able to integrate config addition changes from the distribution? Yeah, that's a really hard question. I'm not really sure there's a correct answer for that. I would say, distributions have their own set of starting configuration, and just like modules do. But then when they actually, when the site starts getting changed and configuration starts getting changed, it's really hard to go back and do those changes or additions from the distribution. I'm not really sure there's a 100% foolproof answer to that. But yeah. Let's see a couple more questions up here. Dana is asking, do you have any tips for exporting multiple related config files via the UI? Related views, content types, taxonomy. Multiple related config files via the UI. I mean, if I understand the question correctly, you can look at configuration files one by one. So you could technically see that. I might not be understanding the question correctly, but when you use the UI, basically you can import and export all of it, or you can export one file, but you can't really import that one file. You need to do that via code. So that's the only drawback of it. Can you talk about split configurations? Yes, I think I've talked about it quite a few times. It's good. It's needed in certain moments, and config split and config ignore allows us to do that. Miro, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Do you have any good flow for distributions and updating child sites with changes from distributions? Okay, we talked about this. There really isn't like the best way, unless you kind of not allow users to change certain things in your site. So maybe you can ignore or use the read-only mode for certain things, so that way the distribution is 100% certain that their initial configuration hasn't changed, and the change that they're adding now will massively break the site. That's the only way I would see it as a viable setup. Terry is asking, is there an automated way to compare configuration files between sites aside from doing manually on the command line interface? I mean, depending on where the site is, you could use a diff. Actually, no, because the configuration wouldn't be exported yet. No, I don't think there is. I think you do need the UI to basically tell you if there's been a change. I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, it's basically what tells you if there's been a change or not. Because unless that change is exported and the configuration is exported and synchronized, there's no different files, right? There's no way to know unless I guess you could compare databases somehow, but that seems also kind of messy. So yeah. Let's see. Scott is saying that it's best to remove modules in 2 separate pushes. First to install, second to remove code. That's a hook install can run in module. I guess it depends on the environment. With Pantheon, we've been lucky enough to be able to do it both. You can actually remove the code, remove the module, and then actually remove the code in one single push and without any issues. So maybe it depends on your environment. Duncan is asking, when you name your configuration splits, do you do one name for prod, stage, test, and local, or group them on functionality based? We normally, maybe our sites aren't that complex. We normally do 2, either prod or dev, and that dev is basically test environment, dev environment, local environments, everything that's not live. So it's either live site or not live site. That's basically how we handle it at Teody. Kevin wasn't asked. Okay, Kevin says wasn't asking about capturing permissions themselves, but granting client permission like create web form results and changes config change. We only would make that obvious through paint. Yes, that is correct, Kevin. The only issue with that is web forms is one of those things where you kind of want the client to be able to create web forms, right? Because that's the whole idea. And also we've seen that it's one of the most it's one of the changes that gets done most on live environments. So what we end up using, if we know that the client is going to do a lot of changes with web forms and they're going to add fields and create another web form, whatever, we basically just config ignore the web forms. You config ignore, it's pretty cool because you can specify like one web form, or you can specify to ignore all web forms using the wildcard thing. So it's pretty cool. Like if you know that a client is going to be using web forms or whatever, you can just config ignore, and then you won't ever have an issue where you accidentally mess up what the client has done. On the other hand, of course, if you're creating a web form on dev, you're going to have to manually recreate it on the live site, right? Which is also bothersome. Jesus. Well, I think this is it. Thank you so much for everybody for coming. It's been again a pleasure and an honor to talk to you guys today. Hopefully, we have configuration a little bit more clear now. And if anybody wants to reach out, please reach out. I think on my profile there's my link, my Twitter. I'm not really a social person, but there's my Twitter and my LinkedIn. And I will make the slides available in a couple minutes after this session was done. So thank you very much. I will take as homework the multi-site thing. I know there's a couple of you that have already said the answer, but I personally didn't know about it. I will research into it a little bit more. And yeah, thanks. Michael is asking, where can we find the slides? I think this year we have like a centralized way, if I'm not mistaken, of putting all the slides in one single place. I will make sure to, or actually, I could probably just link. Yes. This should be public. So here's the, yep. All right, here's the direct links to the slides as well. Let me know if you guys can access that. It should be public. But yeah, and again, thank you very much to everybody that was here and participated. It's been an honor, and can't wait to access the rest of the sessions. Have a great DrupalCon, the rest of you guys, and thanks again. Have a great day.